Hello, this video lecture shows how we can look at history of Europe through the perspective of centers and peripheries. The video lecture is based on the chapter 6.3, Centers and Peripheries, in the handbook called The European Experience, a multi-perspective history of modern Europe, where you can find more detailed version. In the first part, we describe how the concept of center and periphery can be applied for understanding state-building processes and territorial expansion of France and Russia in early modern period. In the second part, we focus on changing spatial patterns of Europe and some of its states in the 19th century, with particular focus on the role of trains and railroads that fundamentally transformed the spatial relations in Europe and its individual countries. Finally, we demonstrate how the optics of centers and peripheries can be applied for 20th century Europe to understand regional discrepancies and social, spatial, economic, political, or cultural asymmetries on different scales from local to global level. The perspective of center and periphery have been conceptualized and applied in many ways in history and social sciences. For instance, we can mention the concept of the world systems by Immanuel Wallerstein and the often used triad of core, periphery, and semi-periphery, which describes the logic of flows and dependencies between core regions and peripheries in economic geography. Other concepts have included the so-called internal peripheries, which means regions that were often formerly independent countries and later became provinces of larger states or imperia. But in economic geography, internal periphery has often referred to declining regions or spaces that were avoided by economic growth. Most typically, peripheries are understood as remote areas far from centers. Often, centers and peripheries take on the dichotomy of center and provinces or city and the country. Whatever use is taken, the concept always implied unequal relations, dependency, hierarchies, and often framed by imaginaries that structure our knowledge, geographical views, and even sense of history in profoundly asymmetrical ways. In what follows, we will address some of these themes in the last 500 years of European history. State building and territorial expansion of states in early modern Europe is one of the spheres that can be approached through the perspective of center and periphery relations. However, the notions of center and periphery are laden with challenges in the early modern context. First, for most European contexts, the coexistence of central and peripheral institutions characterized both state and religious authorities. Many states had multiple centers, while peripheries were often fluid and transient insofar as they became integrated into the heartlands over time. Second, for some larger early modern powers, such as the British, Russian, and Ottoman empires, the distinction between interior and exterior peripheries is helpful. Internal peripheries, such as Scotland and Wales, often differed from both central regions and distant provinces in that they retained the cultural heterogeneity characteristic of peripheries while gradually merging with the core in popular imagination and administrative practice. And third, historians now see early modern states less as bounded territories and more as relatively open spaces in which historically developed communication routes and the natural environment facilitated and increased connectivity far beyond state and provincial borders. There is an open debate, therefore, on whether the very categories of center and periphery obscure rather than illuminate. At any case, we can apply this optics on two specific contexts France, and Russia, and reveal instructive similarities and differences between these two cases. For historians of France, territorial privilege and autonomy, along with representation and the social organization of society, are crucial to understanding the dynamics of center-periphery relations. Historians of Russia trace these changing relations differently. Given the vastness of Russian territory and continuing territorial expansion, the focus is more on the challenges of communication and administration, shifting frontiers, and ever-growing cultural diversity. At the same time, the two cases reveal a degree of contested centralization that is less evident in cases such as early modern Germany, where the central power was often in no position to impose its will. In late medieval and early modern France, many of its territories had privileges. Endowed with assemblies dominated by the nobility, these territories also produced discourses reflecting and reinforcing the ideal of noble governance. The monarchy had a contractual character. The kings conferred privileges, freedoms, or charters that formed the basis of the political and fiscal claims put forward by the social and territorial bodies that benefited from them. The rulers respected this long-standing principle, while the provincial estates carefully recorded these kinds of promises and charters defining their relations with the king. For instance, Provence was proud of his constitution, made up of 53 requests drawn up by the estates of all and presented to King Louis XI at the time of the unification with France. The value of these provincial constitutions depended on how the land has been united with the crown. The jurists of the period distinguished between two types of union. The main type applied to those cases in which territory was given voluntarily to the new sovereign on the basis of an agreement that enshrined the legal equality of the two states concerned, as in the case of Provence. The other form was an ancillary union, which subjected the conquered territory to the laws of the center. The ancillary union fully incorporated the new lands, turning them into mere provinces, subject only to the conditions of their capitulations. Advance of absolutism in the 17th century challenged regional constitutional claims. Central law was imposed in what had become mere provinces. The role of regional institutions was curbed. For instance, Louis XIII stopped convening the assemblies of Dauphiné and Normandy to impose tax reforms. Other conflicts concerned salt tax, which caused a revolt and opened way to the subsequent curbing of the Parlement of Rouen, which was one of the curds of law spread out across France. After the conflict known as the Fronde in the middle of the 17th century, when the nobility sought to weaken central power and take control over the provincial estates, Louis XIV effectively terminated existence of provincial estates. The geographical expansion and establishment of overseas colonies added a new dimension to core periphery relations, as it complicated the question of what constituted the periphery and also gave birth to new institutions. In the so-called New France, for instance, the vast territorial acquisitions in North America, which became a royal province in 1663, specific offices emerged, such as Gouverneur General, with a mixture of military and diplomatic functions, and the Sovereign or Supreme Council, an institution serving as parliament in conquered territories and overseeing matters such as justice, police, and finance. These councils were established beyond the Atlantic, but also in territories that were incorporated into European France from around the mid-17th century, such as Roussillon and Alsace. An interesting case in this respect is Corsica. Following the annexation, the island in 1768, a Conseil Supérieur was introduced on the island, which had been part of the Republic of Genoa for centuries, until it developed in a quasi-independent country from 1730. The new authorities found powerful local institutions with Tuscan Italian as the dominant language. The period of independence turned central assemblies into a sort of national assembly, which in 1755 even adopted a Corsican constitution, which declared the sovereignty of the people, introduced the separation of powers, and full voting rights for the new parliament to all men over 25 years of age. The new French authorities did not tolerate such a system on its periphery. A governor was installed on Corsica, and the estates of Corsica were established after the French model into the 3 estates of nobility, clergy, and the 3rd estate, though some regional specificities, such as limited use of Italian, were tolerated. During the French Revolution, Corsica finally became an integral part of France, and the old regime's institutions were abolished and replaced with republican one. In the Tsardom of Russia, centro-periphery relations were also contested and negotiated, but in comparison to France, they were less subject to formal contracts, let alone constitutions. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Moscow has absorbed the most rival principalities that formerly enjoyed considerable autonomy. Ivan IV, the Terrible, pushed for even more centralized rule. First, governors aided by troops and administrative staff were established throughout the expanding Muscovite state. Second, dozens of central administrative organs, known as prikazy, emerged in Moscow, with some of them devoted to specific functions, such as foreign affairs, and others to territories, such as the Kazan or Siberian prikazy. But centralization remained patchy and contested. The early modern periphery was an open, diverse, and transient space. As the Tsardom's border was extended further to the east and south, it was secured by even more fortification lines and mainly local military servitors. Still, beyond garrison towns, central rule remained elusive. During rebellions by Cossacks, who otherwise offered military service to the Tsars, central troops fought for years to re-establish control. Even after such revolts on the Russian side of the border, most issues concerning justice, finances, military service, and land use had to be negotiated between various state, religious, and local elites, usually without any written charters or representative bodies. Beyond the open border, by contrast, former agreements played a role in defining relationships with adjacent allies, including the Ukrainian Cossacks. The latter's allegiance to the Tsar in return for autonomy was enshrined in the so-called March Articles of 1654, also known in Russian as the so-called Treaty of Pereyaslav. Written agreements known by the Turkic work Sherti also formalized relations with Muslim Tatar and Kalmyk nomadic leaders, defining, among other things, reciprocal monetary obligations. The country became more centralized under Catherine II after a series of reforms and territorial reorganizations, which also defined the responsibilities and rights of towns, provinces, and districts. By the late 18th century, the empire abolished most formerly autonomous formations on the frontier. Still, central rule remained territorialized because many central laws were applicable only to specific regions, such as the western provinces, the Volga region, and so on. As a result, the situation of a particular group or subject could be vastly different depending on where they lived. Territorial expansion and organization were key to center-periphery relations in Russia. Assemblies such as Duma and popular representation were less central to the development of these relations than in France, Germany, and elsewhere in Europe. Zemský Sobor did not systematically channel regional interests. With few exceptions, there were no regional assemblies or parliaments recognized by the center. It was only in 1766 that Catherine II introduced noble assemblies at the provincial and district level and allowed them to look into local matters. The system in Russian Empire was complex and in many ways differed from Western Europe. The idea of three distinct estates in a Western European sense fails to capture the real-life hierarchies of early modern Russia. Other categories such as religion, ethnicity, or tax-paying had greater legal impact. Ethno-religious differences were just as important as social distinction in Russian imperial society. Unlike many Western monarchies, the Russian Empire took pride in its cultural diversity while privileging the Russian Orthodox. Since some Russian regions had large percentages or even majorities of non-Russians, the legal status of these communities would also shape the relationship between Moscow, St. Petersburg, and various peripheries. Moreover, the reality of large indigenous communities and predominantly Russian-staffed local administrations would raise the question of which peripheries were also Russian colonies. The center's advance across Eurasia led in the 1730s to debate about Russia's true center and periphery. By selecting the Ural Mountains as the natural border between Europe and Asia, geographer and statesman Vasily Tatishchev divided Russia into a European and Asiatic part, thereby confirming the European identity of St. Petersburg elites, and turned the land beyond the mountains into the empire's ultimate periphery. Talk of Russia's interior provinces inside its European half soon became commonplace. The debate on Russianness, however, along with extensive discussions of Russia's geographical core and peripheries, became a more prominent theme in the 19th century. The long 19th century was the century of the steam engine. Due to its amazing power, the exchange of people, goods, and ideas reached new dimensions. Railways were regarded as symbols of progress, transporting products and, so it was thought, values to the remotest peripheries and regions. Most importantly, railroads were able to transcend the obstacles of space, distance, and time. Taken together, they seemed to be a solution to one of the crucial questions of European history, beginning from the mid-19th century, the integration of internal and external peripheries and their connection to economic and political centers. To be sure, some important changes and improvements in transportation happened already before the age of trains, such as making of new and improved roads or canals. But the steam engine had a profound impact on transportation and on the reshaping of the center and periphery relations on all spatial scales. The establishment of the railways brought response to three different requirements. Railways were a response to the demand for transport in countries or regions that are already well served by roads and canals, but where there was strong traffic pressure on infrastructure. This was the case in Northwestern Europe, where the first railway systems were built from the 1830s and 1840s. Especially from the 1850s onwards, Trains were to serve as a deliberate solution to the problem of economic backwardness, as a response to the backwardness of the land transport system and the economy in general. This was the case in Spain, Russia, southern Italy, and western France. Finally, in the third case, the train was perceived as a means of establishing a system of long-distance exchanges that would enable the national space to be structured and integrated into a larger European space. This was the Portuguese project, but also that of Belgium and the Netherlands. State control of the railways was a guarantee of national independence and allowed the unification of the territory. The hierarchy of places and spaces was transformed rapidly by the mobile steam engine. The movement of goods increased dramatically thanks to this transport revolution. Between 1840s and 1870s, freight costs fell by 70% in international trade. This triggered a process of specialization in the different regions of Europe between agricultural, mining, or industrial activities. A more structured geographical landscape was created and partly embedded in old spatial patterns. The most industrialized and urbanized zone extended from the center of England to the north of the Italian peninsula, passing through the Rhine and Rhone regions, accompanied by a few more distant industrial districts, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula. This concentration was redoubled by the means of transport. Maps of the expansion of the railways outline this area of greater density. As the railway played an important role in the strengthening of central districts and regions, it also, conversely, doomed others to decline. Many once prospering cities or whole regions faced deprivation when they were cut off from railway infrastructures and the economic opportunities they provided. These new infrastructures could leverage the creation of national markets. And what was more, railways fostered internal and transnational migration on a whole new scale. In search of opportunities, people departed agricultural regions for industrial cities, as well as mining and metallurgical regions. The history of the railway networks in the three peripheral empires in Europe show, however, a very different history from that of Western Europe. Hungary didn't have convenient transportation conditions as it was landlocked. Still, later in the 19th century, railroads were built as a means to supply European commodity market with Hungarian grain. Ultimately, however, the low cost of transportation made Hungary's export unable to compete with much cheaper grain imported to Europe from the United States. Russian empires saw rapid growth of railroads from the middle of the 19th century, as the state saw many roles for them. Railways were meant as means to finally integrate provinces, often very remote from the center. Trains were also part of the so-called civilizing mission meant to spread ideas and innovations to backward peripheries. The growing network of railroads symbolized the imperial power, but also had more banal economic and strategic reasons. Yet, the railways had also impact back on the centers, as the trains facilitated influx of many people and their countryside values from the peripheries to St. Petersburg or Moscow. In the Ottoman Empire, the link between railroads and central-periphery relations was more complex, as the Ottoman elites saw the core of the empire in Anatolia and the Balkans, while periphery was considered the eastern and southern provinces such as Iraq or Libya. It was there where new railroads were to signify imperial prestige and secure control of provinces. In the Balkan territory, the situation was far more complex, as the interplay of many actors, namely the Ottoman state, regional elites, but also foreign investors, and their different interests was the case. The Balkans progressively became a true European periphery, with the economically stronger Western countries organizing and profiting from major railroad constructions. While the center-periphery relations and asymmetries were the case in previous centuries, in late 20th century, more critical scholarship evolved, often outside Europe, for instance, in Latin America, which pointed out not just the dependencies and asymmetries, but also intellectual operations and biased categories, which were called the geopolitics of knowledge. That means intellectual means of centrifugation and peripheralization, or construction of superior, inferior, and subordinated spaces. It was argued that Europe self-positioned itself as the center of the world through particular knowledges and concepts such as progress or development, or even through specifically European way of seeing history. Other important reflections were inspired by the concept of Orientalism by Edward Said and led to critical look at various Orientalizing or othering discourses, which are applicable not just on the global level, but also at the intra-European level. The center and periphery relations cannot be fully understood without realizing the major impacts of changing geopolitical contexts in Europe over the 20th century. In the early 20th century, the power of Great Britain was at its peak, so that we can talk about the so-called Pax Britannica, though challenged by Germany. Europe was still the hegemon in the world. This changed, in particular after the World War II, that brought European hegemony to the end, while Europe itself was divided into two asymmetrical systems of centers lying basically outside or on the fringe of Europe, and which can be also called in Latin as Pax America and Pax Sovietica. In the former case, the United States maintained economic hegemony via stabilization of Western Europe, while providing defense shield, all via a range of frameworks and institutions such as the Marshall Plan or the NATO. In the latter case, Pax Sovietica, the bloc was in fact a highly asymmetric system of political center in the USSR and many satellite countries, in which economic relations were ultimately subjected to defense purposes, and which brought some of the most advanced countries, like the Czechoslovakia, for instance, or Eastern Germany, to more peripheral status. Cold War division into two blocks still lingers in mental maps of Europeans until today. When looking at the 20th century Europe through the perspective of core and periphery model, the continent can be roughly described as a gradient structure with northwest as the core, some countries or regions in the inner circle as semi-cores or semi-peripheries, and the belt stretching more or less from southwest to southeast to northeast as the periphery that has been characterized by low industry, less advanced agriculture, and a focus on exporting raw materials. Unequal economic relations maintained by the core region and serving to its benefit were complemented by a one-directional flow of standards, norms, and models toward the periphery. The political division of Europe after World War II gave birth to a two-pole structure within which parts of European semi-periphery, such as Czechoslovakia or Eastern Germany, became subordinated to the peripheral yet powerful Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the Cold War order, Western Europe remained as the clear center, while East Central Europe becoming a periphery within the EU, and Eastern Europe once again assigned an ambiguous status of European borderland. Peripheral macro-regions have been subject to orientalizing discourses or stereotyping imaginaries, such as the Balkanism, which deployed a stigmatizing imagery of violence-prone or inherently unstable and never quite European region, or the discourses of lazy, irresponsible South that were reactivated, for instance, during the recent debt crisis. The peripheries or semi-peripheries, to the contrary, often produced various counter-imaginaries, which tried to position them in a better position, such as, for instance, the discourses of belonging to the West or ideas of the morally superior Central Europe in the middle of the continent. Many center-periphery relations were also at play on a micro level, within the centers and peripheries of Europe or within individual states. It would be wrong, for instance, to imagine France as a monolithic core country. Rather, a regional discrepancy evolved in the 19th century and crystallized in the 20s between industrializing northern France and its increasingly agricultural south. Regional discrepancies between the rich Italian north and the poor Italian south are even more pronounced. From the perspective of urban geography, the core region of rich, heavily populated, and globally significant cities has established formations that have been called, for instance, urban pentagon, basically a territory marked out by London, Paris, Milano, Munich, and Hamburg, or the so-called blue banana, a curved belt that can be observed stretching from the English Midlands to northern Italy. Whether a particular country was part of the European center or rather of its peripheries, small internal peripheries often emerged. Regions that were comparatively less industrialized, less urbanized, poorly connected by railroads and motorways, tended toward a high rate of outmigration. An example was, for instance, South Bohemia in the early 20th century, a region which also witnessed remarkable efforts by regionalist movement to counterbalance dominance of Prague and to stimulate regional growth. Sometimes the provinces were more offensively positioned against the center. In Germany of the early 20th century, for instance, the polarity between the provinces and all too rapidly evolving Berlin carried traits of a cultural war between metropolitan cosmopolitanism and what was promoted as genuinely national German culture. In yet other contexts, peripheral regions were cradles of what has been called peripheral nationalism in cases like Scotland, Flanders, or Catalonia. Transition toward the so-called second modernity and post-industrial society in the late 20th century put new developments on the map, with some of the old industrial centers now turning into peripheries. Elsewhere, areas such as, for instance, southern Finland became champions of a new so-called knowledge-based economy focused on smart technologies, design, but also healthy and eco-friendly lifestyles. While the spatial hierarchies and disparities remain in existence, they have nevertheless become more complex and less easy to draw on the map, with the rich metropolitan areas of the global cities coexisting with underdeveloped regions and affluent districts bordering with rundown neighborhoods. The cultural development based on the creative industries, cultural heritage, and tourism became a new panacea for many deindustrialized regions and other areas that lagged behind, sometimes instigated by national or European cultural policies and frameworks. In parallel, grassroots movements have challenged pervasive spatial imaginaries such as association of center with cities and periphery with the countryside. For instance, the international Città Slow movement that emerged in Italy in 1999 and which is composed of small towns with the aim of promoting slow living, may serve as an example of these efforts. Relation between centers and peripheries is an important, yet often neglected perspective on European history. Still, we hope that by showing this kind of another story of European diversity, which also helps us understand dynamics and patterns of political development today, we motivated you to read more about this topic in our handbook, or you can also check the sources on the History website. Thank you very much.